There comes a moment when the one who has spent their entire life absorbing the pain of others finally breaks. Not in rage, not in hatred, but in silence, the kind that no longer trembles, the kind that no longer explains itself. It is the silence of an empath who has seen too much, felt too deeply, and realized that compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. Carl Jung once wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. He was not speaking about pride. He was describing the moment a soul stops bleeding for the world and begins to see the wound in itself. And among his hundreds of documented cases, there was one that he never published in full, a case that haunted him for decades. The case of the empath who snapped. She was not fragile. She was not weak. She was, in Jung's own words, a woman whose sensitivity had no skin. Every vibration of pain, every whisper of anger, every unspoken thought around her, she absorbed it. The sadness of strangers became her shadow. The grief of the world became her pulse. And for years, she mistook that pain for purpose. But there is a cost to carrying the emotions of everyone else. Your own soul begins to decay under the weight of borrowed suffering. She became the healer for others, but the stranger to herself. She learned how to listen, how to comfort, how to save, but never how to say no. Jung noticed something extraordinary. The more she tried to heal others, the sicker she became. Not physically, but existentially. Her empathy had turned parasitic, not because she wanted to help, but because she needed to help. Her entire sense of worth had fused with the wounds of the world. And then, one day, she stopped. Jung wrote, there was no rage in her, only a frightening calm, as though she had made a pact with something ancient within. That was the day she snapped, not violently, but spiritually. She had spent years trying to redeem everyone else's darkness, never realizing that the darkness she kept meeting was her own reflection. The world calls it burnout. Jung called it individuation. The breaking point of the empath is not the end of empathy, it is the beginning of truth. When the empath snaps, they don't lose their kindness. They lose their illusion. They realize that compassion without boundaries is not love, it's submission. And that light without shadow is not purity, it's denial. The empath's curse is not that they feel too much, it's that they feel without awareness. They believe they are saving others, when in truth, they are trying to avoid their own unconscious. For what is empathy if not the mirror of what you've repressed? You cannot feel the pain of others so deeply unless it already lives somewhere inside you. Jung saw this clearly. He wrote that she had been possessed by the archetype of the healer. Her goodness had become her prison. Every tear she wiped away, every burden she carried, every soul she mended was another chain binding her to her own unhealed self. He asked her one question. What would happen if you stopped saving people? She froze. Her lips trembled. And after a long silence, she whispered, I wouldn't know who I am. That was the moment of revelation. The day the empath snapped was the day she finally met herself. Not the saint, not the savior, not the caretaker, but the raw, unpolished self beneath all that performance, the self that wanted to scream, to rage, to exist for something more than the pain of others. And that is where her transformation began. To the world, she looked colder, but to herself, she was finally alive. She learned that empathy without self-respect is emotional slavery, that forgiveness without discernment is self-betrayal, that love, to be real, must include the courage to walk away. This awakening terrified those around her, because the empath who snaps no longer feeds the emotional economy of the weak. They stop entertaining the manipulator. They stop validating the victim who refuses to grow. They stop giving energy to those who only know how to take. When the empath snaps, they reclaim the sacred right to anger, not the blind rage that destroys, but the divine fire that protects. Anger becomes the sword that cuts through false compassion. Boundaries become the architecture of freedom, and solitude becomes the temple of power. Jung described her transformation as the death of the mother archetype within her psyche. She had been living as the eternal caretaker, the psychic nurse of the unconscious world. But when she withdrew that energy, something extraordinary happened. The people who once depended on her began to confront their own darkness. The parasites of her compassion were forced to evolve. Her absence became the teacher, and in that absence she found her soul. This is the paradox of awakening. You do not heal the world by saving everyone. You heal the world by becoming whole within yourself. Because a whole being radiates truth, and truth heals without effort. The empath who snaps is not a villain. They are the phoenix archetype. They burn their identity to ash so that authenticity can rise. They stop absorbing emotion and start transmuting it. They stop asking, how can I help them? And start asking, what in me attracted this? They stop seeing compassion as sacrifice and start seeing it as alignment. The world does not understand this version of empathy because it is not submissive, not performative, not soft. It is fierce, discerning, sovereign. It is the empathy of a warrior, not the one who saves, but the one who sees. And this is the empath's final evolution: to feel everything, yet remain unmoved, to love deeply, yet remain detached, to give freely, yet remain whole. It is the art of carrying light through darkness without becoming either. Jung once wrote, "The shadow is the seat of creativity." The empath who integrates their shadow becomes unstoppable, because now their sensitivity is not weakness, it is radar. They can feel deception before it speaks. They can sense truth before it's visible. They can discern energy as effortlessly as breathing. They no longer absorb, they observe. They no longer mirror, they manifest. They no longer reflect the pain of the world, they transform it. When the empath snaps, they don't become cold, they become clear. They don't stop loving, they start loving consciously. And through that clarity, they begin to walk through the world like an unseen force, grounded, impenetrable, radiant. Because true empathy was never about feeling others' pain. It was about recognizing your oneness with all things and choosing to stay sovereign within it. That is when compassion becomes wisdom. That is when love becomes power. That is when sensitivity becomes strength. The day the empath snapped was not the day she broke, it was the day she remembered that her purpose was never to be the world's healer. Her purpose was to awaken, and by awakening, to remind others that they can do the same. And in that realization, Jung found something profound, something that still echoes through the psychology of our time. The empath who snaps does not lose their humanity. They reclaim their divinity. Because when you stop bleeding for others, you finally have blood enough to resurrect yourself. When you stop chasing broken souls, you discover that you were the one waiting to be found. And when you stop trying to save the world, you realize you've already changed it simply by becoming the whole. Jung wrote later in his private letters that the most dangerous stage of any awakening is not the breakthrough, but what comes after. Because once you've seen through illusion, once you've stopped mistaking empathy for identity, the world you return to is no longer the same. The empath who has snapped cannot go back. They cannot unsee what they have seen, nor unfeel what they have learned. Their compassion has evolved from emotion into understanding. And understanding is the most subversive power of all because it cannot be manipulated. For a time, the newly awakened empath walks through life like a ghost among the living. They see people speaking, but all they hear is projection. They see kindness offered, but all they sense is transaction. They see pain disguised as virtue and smiles that hide hunger. Not because they have grown cynical, but because they finally see the psychic machinery behind every interaction. You see, when you live for years as a mirror, You become fluent in reflection. You learn how people bend light to hide their shadows. But when you stop mirroring and begin observing, truth becomes luminous. It cuts through masks, through words, through charm. And what remains is raw humanity, beautiful, but terrifyingly honest. That honesty isolates at first, because most of society is built upon emotional performance, the need to appear kind, selfless, agreeable. But the empath who has awakened no longer performs. They have burned the mask. They speak truth that vibrates at a frequency too high for comfort. They see manipulation not as evil, but as unconsciousness, and they refuse to play along. And this is where their second transformation begins, the rebirth of sovereignty. The empath realizes that energy exchange is the true economy of the world. Every interaction is a trade, attention, emotion, time, spirit. To give unconsciously is to become bankrupt. To give with awareness is to become divine. They learn that saying no is not cruelty, it is spiritual hygiene. They learn that detachment is not coldness, it is clarity. They learn that compassion without self-awareness breeds codependence. But compassion with consciousness creates evolution. Jung called this stage the withdrawal of projection. And it is the moment when the empath retrieves all the power they once scattered across others, the love given to those who could not reciprocate, the time invested in those who refused to grow, the empathy wasted on those who weaponized it. They begin to call their soul back from every battlefield of the heart. And when that energy returns, something magnificent happens. The empath becomes magnetic, not because they seek attention, but because they radiate authenticity. The world senses it. Animals, strangers, even the air around them responds differently. There is a stillness in their presence, a gravity that pulls truth out of others. They have become an axis stable, unmoved, untouchable. It is said that when you reach this state, you no longer attract wounded souls. You attract mirrors, people who reflect your own wholeness, your own balance. Your relationships transform from rescue missions into revolutions. You begin to meet those who match your frequency, not your wounds. You realize that the higher self cannot be reached by dragging others upward, only by rising yourself and letting them follow if they choose. This is the divine law of resonance. What you are internally determines what you experience externally. You can no longer beg the universe to change. You become the change, and the universe rearranges to match you. It is the point where empathy evolves into mastery. The empath who snaps becomes the sage. They move through life like water, soft, fluid, unstoppable. They can touch pain without drowning in it. They can hold space without absorbing it. They can love deeply without attachment. They can walk through the fire of the collective unconscious and not be burned because they are no longer flammable. Jung observed that this woman, the one who had once nearly dissolved under the pain of others, now radiated a presence that unsettled people, not because she was unkind, but because she was free. And freedom in a world built on emotional captivity is threatening. Freedom exposes dependency. Freedom exposes pretense. Freedom exposes everything that hides behind victimhood. When an empath becomes free, their silence becomes louder than others' noise. Their boundaries become lessons. Their peace becomes a mirror that forces others to confront their own storms. And that is why awakening is lonely, not because no one understands you, but because your very existence becomes a form of truth that others are not yet ready to see. But eventually, loneliness transforms into solitude, and solitude becomes communion. Because once you have faced the vastness of your own being, you are never truly alone again. You begin to feel the invisible, the field of consciousness that connects all things. You sense the intelligence that moves through chaos, the order beneath randomness. You begin to understand that empathy was never about emotion, it was about unity. It was your soul's way of remembering its oneness with the whole. Now, empathy becomes a language of creation. You no longer feel others to suffer with them, you feel them to lift them. Your energy begins to calibrate rooms, conversations, situations. You no longer chase healing, you are healing embodied. This is the empath's final metamorphosis, the evolution from mirror to magnet, from absorber to creator, from healer to alchemist. You become capable of holding paradox, power and gentleness, distance and intimacy, love and detachment without conflict. Because you finally understand that opposites are not enemies, they are lovers in eternal dance. Light exists to know darkness. Compassion exists to meet shadow. You exist to awaken. And when you reach this place, the world begins to reveal its secret structure. You see that every person who drained you was a teacher. Every betrayal was an initiation. Every heartbreak was an invitation to boundaries. Every collapse was a rehearsal for sovereignty. Your empathy was never a curse. It was the furnace in which your soul was forged. And then you smile. Not the smile of triumph, but the smile of knowing. The empath who once drowned in emotion now stands upon it like still water. They have learned the final law of power. You do not rise by fighting the darkness. You rise by becoming the light that renders it irrelevant. The day the empath snapped was not an ending. It was the awakening of a soul tired of pretending to be small. It was the moment humanity took a step toward its own reflection and dared to love it without losing itself. And somewhere in Jung's old notes, written faintly in the margins, he summarized her case in a single line, one that still resonates like thunder through time. She did not heal by being good. She healed by becoming real. That is the secret every empath must one day discover. That the world does not need your constant sympathy. It needs your wholeness. It needs your truth. It needs your awakened self, the one who no longer bleeds for others but breathes life into them by existing in full consciousness. Because when the empath snaps, it is not destruction, it is resurrection. It is the soul reclaiming its throne. It is the light remembering its source. And once that happens, once the empath becomes aware, there is nothing left to fix, nothing left to fight, and nothing left to fear. There is only presence. There is only power. There is only the quiet, steady heartbeat of truth, the sound of an awakened soul, finally at peace with itself. And yet, the story does not truly end there, because awakening, though divine, is not a destination. It is a rhythm. It moves in spirals, not straight lines. Even the awakened empath must continue to descend and ascend within themselves, to revisit old wounds from higher vantage points, to learn that healing is not about erasing pain, but transforming its meaning. After her awakening, Jung's patient began to write. He encouraged it. He called her words the language of the soul when the mouth has grown tired of lying. She no longer wrote for others, she wrote to witness herself. Every sentence was a mirror, every paragraph a confession. And in those writings, Jung saw something extraordinary, a consciousness integrating itself. Not analyzing, not suppressing, but dialoguing with the unseen. She wrote, I do not wish to be loved anymore for my kindness. I wish to be seen for my truth, even when it is sharp. That sentence struck Jung deeply. It echoed a universal truth, that most people seek love as approval, not recognition. But to be recognized, to be truly seen, you must first be willing to reveal what the world does not want to see. Your selfishness, your resentment, your hunger, your capacity for rage, your longing to dominate, to rebel, to destroy the very systems that once enslaved you under politeness and compassion. For the empath who has awakened, shadow work becomes liberation, because to accept your darkness is to reclaim your power. Every part of you you've condemned, the jealous one, the angry one, the prideful one, becomes fuel for authenticity once integrated. You begin to see that the shadow was never evil. It was merely energy misdirected by fear. Jung called this process the alchemical union, the merging of gold and lead, spirit and matter, heaven and earth. He believed that the most evolved souls were not those who transcended their instincts, but those who integrated them into consciousness. To be divine is not to escape the animal within, but to teach it how to serve the soul. And so, as she continued her transformation, her energy shifted again. She became bolder, sharper, freer. She laughed more, but her laughter carried weight. She loved more deeply, but without dependency. She could hold contradiction without collapse. She no longer sought to be understood, she became understanding itself. Jung described her presence as radiantly unsettling, because she carried no false light. She embodied the full spectrum of human emotion, the saint and the sinner, the healer and the destroyer. She no longer sought harmony by suppressing conflict. She found harmony by embracing duality. This, Jung believed, was the highest form of psychological wholeness, the union of opposites within one soul. Her story became legend among Jung's students, though few ever read the full transcript, because it wasn't merely a case of psychological recovery. It was an initiation. The journey from empath to sovereign being mirrors the journey of humanity itself, from innocence to awareness, from projection to power, from servitude to mastery. And the deeper lesson Jung wrote in his journals was this: compassion without consciousness leads to decay. Consciousness without compassion leads to tyranny. The union of both that is divinity in human form. This is the balance the awakened empath must maintain to feel the world without losing themselves, and to see through illusion without becoming cruel. In time, she began to work as a therapist herself, but her methods were unorthodox. She would sit in silence with her patients for hours before speaking. Sometimes she would ask a single question and end the session. Sometimes she would say nothing at all, because she had learned what most forget, that presence heals more than words ever could. And in her presence, people began to confront their own shadows. She didn't save them. She mirrored them, as the universe had once mirrored her. Jung described this as the divine paradox of healing, that to awaken others, one must cease trying to awaken them. Her silence became her medicine. Her clarity became her compassion. Her boundaries became her love. And though she never sought recognition, whispers of her work spread throughout Europe. They called her the woman who could make you meet yourself. There was one encounter Jung wrote about years later that encapsulated her transformation. A man came to her bitter, wounded, enraged at the world. He accused her of being cold, detached, heartless. He said, "You call yourself an empath, but you don't feel anything." She smiled faintly and replied, "I feel everything. I've just stopped making your pain my identity." That line became immortal among Jung's notes. It was the mark of true evolution, feeling without identification, to touch the collective suffering of humanity without drowning in it, to love deeply yet remain free. And this is the pinnacle of human consciousness. To walk through the madness of the modern world, absorbing nothing that is not yours, to see manipulation and not react, to witness cruelty and still act from truth, not resentment, to hold compassion and clarity in the same hand, to embody love as power, not performance. Because the empath's final awakening is not emotional, it is cosmic. They realize that every vibration they once absorbed was part of a grand symphony, that the pain they once carried was humanity's collective shadow moving through them, seeking light. And by facing it within themselves, they participated in healing the world, not by effort, but by frequency. Jung once said that the individual who looks inward saves the world by saving himself. That is the empath's sacred task, not to fix the external, but to harmonize the internal. Because when one soul becomes whole, the collective psyche shifts. And so she lived quietly, not as a saint, not as a savior, but as a mirror of truth. She no longer sought validation, for she had become her own authority. She no longer feared rejection, for she had befriended solitude. She no longer resisted life, for she had seen that all suffering was simply resistance to what is. When Jung visited her many years later, he wrote that she greeted him with the peace of one who had transcended the cycle of becoming. He asked if she still considered herself an empath. She smiled and said, "No, I am consciousness with a heartbeat." That single phrase encapsulated everything Jung had ever tried to express through his work. Because empathy, awareness, and awakening are not separate, they are stages of remembering, stages of the soul realizing that it was never a victim of emotion, but the author of experience. And so, the haunting case of the empath who snapped became something else entirely, not a tragedy, but a prophecy. A warning to those who confuse goodness with surrender. A reminder that to love the world, you must not dissolve into it. You must become its mirror, clear, reflective, impenetrable, awake. Because when you stop bleeding for others, your love becomes medicine. When you stop chasing peace, your presence becomes peace. When you stop explaining yourself, your silence becomes truth. And when you finally snap, not from anger, but from awakening, you do not destroy the empath. You give birth to the sage. That is when you no longer feel the world. You move it, not with words, not with effort, but with the quiet gravity of someone who has made peace with the storm within. And so the story of the empath, the one who once lived at the mercy of every vibration, every heartbreak, every unspoken sorrow, comes to rest where all awakenings must end, in stillness. Not the stillness of avoidance, but the stillness of arrival. Because, in the end, all roads lead here. The confrontation between who you were told to be and who you actually are. The empath's journey was never about feeling more, it was about seeing through illusion, through identity, through the noise that kept her small, through the kindness that was never love, but fear of rejection dressed as virtue, through the savior complex that was never compassion, but an escape from her own pain. When she finally stood in the naked truth of her being, she realized there was nothing left to fix, nothing to prove, nothing to chase. She had outgrown the very paradigm of suffering. The empath who snapped became the witness. The witness became awareness, and awareness pure, unconditioned, became peace. Jung once described enlightenment not as the flight of the soul into light, but as the descent of light into darkness. The empath snapping was that descent, the implosion of illusion, the burning away of sentimentality and self-sacrifice until all that remained was essence raw, uncorrupted, infinite. Now, her empathy was no longer a wound, it was wisdom. It no longer came from fear of others' pain, but from understanding its function. She saw that suffering is not punishment, it is purification. It breaks what must break, so that the soul can finally breathe. Her silence became her sermon. Her eyes, once flooded with emotion, became mirrors of eternity. People came to her, not to be saved, but to remember, because in her presence, they no longer felt understood, they felt seen. And to be seen by someone who has walked through fire and come out whole, that is the most healing experience in existence. She no longer called herself a healer. She no longer called herself an empath. She had become something far more dangerous to the modern world. A being who could not be manipulated by guilt. A being who could not be enslaved by pity. A being whose kindness was no longer compliance. That is what Jung meant when he wrote that only the wounded physician heals. Not because pain makes one holy, but because one who has survived their own unconscious can hold another's without drowning. The healed empath becomes the midwife of awakening. They no longer pull others from the dark, they stand in it, radiating enough light for others to find their own way out. There is an old alchemical saying, solve et coagula, dissolve and reform. That is what she did. That is what every empath must eventually do. Dissolve the false self built from fear and reform the true self forged in awareness. This is not rebellion. It is resurrection. And so, as the world continued its endless theater of chaos, she lived quietly observing, guiding when asked, but never interfering. Not because she didn't care, but because she understood that every soul must meet its own darkness. To interrupt that process is to rob another of transformation. In the evenings, she would walk alone by the water, not in melancholy, but in communion. The same sensitivity that once tormented her now connected her to everything: the wind, the trees, the hum of existence itself. Every sound was language, every silence was song. And in that stillness, she whispered the final realization that Jung later quoted in his notes: to feel everything is to drown. To understand everything is to breathe. The empath had become understanding itself, no longer a sponge for emotion, but a vessel for awareness. No longer a martyr, but a mystic. No longer reacting to energy, but directing it. She had become what Jung called the self, the integrated totality of light and shadow, conscious and unconscious, human and divine. And from that state, empathy transcended emotion and became creation. Her thought sculpted reality. Her silence moved mountains. Her presence alone altered the vibration of the room. Because when you have walked through your own underworld and made peace with its monsters, you no longer fear the dark, you command it. You no longer crave light, you emanate it. That is the final transformation of the empath. From absorber to alchemist, from mirror to master, from savior to source. And if Jung were alive today, perhaps he would say that the world itself has become the empath, absorbing its own chaos, drowning in its own projection, begging for someone to save it. But just as she learned, the world too will one day snap, not in destruction, but in awakening. It will realize that salvation was never external, that every war, every division, every cry for justice was a reflection of its own unconscious seeking integration. And when that happens, when humanity finally faces itself without flinching, the collective empath will awaken, just as she did. The pain of centuries will dissolve into understanding. The endless pendulum of victims and villains will come to stillness. And the species that once bled empathy will finally embody consciousness. That is a prophecy buried in Jung's most haunting case. Not that the empath snapped, but that through her, he glimpsed the future evolution of the human soul. For one day, every sensitive being must reach that sacred breaking point where feeling gives way to knowing, where compassion gives way to clarity, where love ceases to ache and begins to be. And when that day comes, you too will snap, not into madness, but into remembrance. You will stop bleeding for what you cannot change. You will stop apologizing for your boundaries. You will stop confusing weakness with kindness. And in that silence, cold, clean, infinite, you will finally hear it. The sound of your true self-awakening. Not the healer, not the martyr, not the empath, but the whole, sovereign, eternal consciousness behind it all. And when that moment arrives, you will understand what she meant, what Jung saw, and what every soul must one day remember. You were never meant to carry the pain of the world. You were meant to awaken within it, and by doing so, set it free.